Before we begin the story, let us know in the comments from which city are you watching. Enjoy the story, everyone. Leela was a young woman facing countless hardships with her son Ian. With no other options, she decided to participate in an unusual auction where women were auctioned off like objects and their company purchased by wealthy, powerful men. For her, it wasn't a choice. It was her only chance sitting in a corner of the luxurious hall. Lila felt the crushing weight of the decisions that had brought her there. Her heart pounded erratically, each beat filled with fear and uncertainty about what lay ahead. But she kept thinking of her son, Ian, who was in the care of her elderly neighbor that night. The overdue bills, the looming threat of eviction, and the nights Aman went to bed hungry had driven her to make this unthinkable decision. The event organizer, a man in an impeccable suit and a forced smile, approached her to give instructions. Remember, Layla, maintain your composure. Smile and don't look directly at the guests, he instructed. Before walking away, the hall was filled with men in elegant attire, watching each woman as if they were priceless works of art on display. Leah felt a lump in her throat as her name was called. Lot number 23. The organizer announced in the theatrical, calculated voice. Leah's legs trembled as she climbed the steps to the brightly lit stage. The intense lights momentarily blinded her, and the heat from the spotlights brought beads of sweat to her forehead. She tried to keep her head held high, but felt the predatory gazes fixed on her. A true exotic beauty. The organizer continued using adjectives that made Lila feel even more exposed. The crowd murmured in approval. Suddenly, a deep, commanding voice cut through the room. 1 million. The hall fell into complete silence. All eyes turned toward a man with tan skin and piercing eyes seated in the last row. He exuded an aura of power and authority. Karim Al-Fid, an Arab magnate known for his wealth and discretion, had made his bid. The organizer, surprised by the opening sum, repeated the amount to confirm no other bids followed. Sold. He announced wearing a satisfied smile. Leah felt her legs weaken, but she kept her composure as she stepped off the stage. Her life had just changed, irreversibly. Karim approached her, his gaze serious and unreadable. "We need to discuss the terms," he said, calmly extending his hand to guide her. Leah hesitated but followed him to a private room, where the fate she had sealed on the stage would officially be determined. The room was spacious and elegantly furnished. Karim gestured toward an armchair for Lila to sit. He walked over to a nearby table and picked up an envelope that had been placed there beforehand. "Here's the contract," he said, handing it to Lila. Read it carefully. Lila took the document, her hands trembling. The silence in the room was deafening. As she read the first few clauses, her breathing grew heavier as she reached the main section. "You want me to have a child and leave it with you?" she asked, her voice shaking. Karam crossed his arms and nodded. "I need an heir after the child is born. You'll leave. The contract makes that very clear." Lila stood up, a wave of indignation and fear washing over her. "I can't do this. I won't abandon my own child." Karim's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained steady. "You knew what you were getting into when you entered that auction. There's no room for regret now. This is inhumane." Layla shot back, gripping the contract tightly. "Do you think you can just buy a child and discard the mother?" Karim stepped forward, his presence dominating the room. "I paid $1 million for you?" "Lila, this wasn't a whim. Now you have no choice." Lila felt her heart race. She knew she was trapped in a situation she couldn't easily escape. Karim placed a pen on the table in front of her. "Sign the contract. Once the baby is born, you'll receive the money and be free to go on with your life." Leah stared at the contract, her hands shaking with anger and despair. She thought of Ayan and the sacrifice she was making to secure his future. Tears threatened to fall, but she held them back. "This isn't right," she murmured, sitting down again. Karim leaned in, his gaze intense. "What's right or wrong doesn't matter here. What matters is that you honor the agreement." Layla knew she had no choice. With a heavy heart, she picked up the pen and signed the contract. Karim took the document and said, "Very well. Tomorrow morning we'll do the necessary medical exams, and you'll be taken to my mansion. Get some rest." He left the room, leaving alone with her thoughts and regrets. She looked at her signature on the contract, feeling as though she had sealed her own fate. The next day, a limousine waited for Lila in front of the small apartment where she lived. Saying goodbye to Eamon had been brief and painful. She had told him she needed to work far away for a few months, promising to call whenever she could, the child innocent and unaware. Waved with a confident smile, oblivious to what his mother was enduring. The journey to the mansion was silent. Layla stared out the window, watching the desert landscape gradually give way to modern, luxurious structures. When they arrived, the grandeur of the property left her speechless. Tall iron gates opened to reveal immaculate gardens and a mansion that seemed straight out of a fairy tale. Kareem was waiting at the entrance. His expression as serious as ever, he guided her inside, briefly explaining the rooms and the house rules. Your private privacy will be respected, but I expect you to fulfill your part of the agreement. Without question, he said, before leaving her in the care of a staff member named Amira. Amir, a kind middle-aged woman, showed Leela to her room. The space was furnished with elegant decor and soft tones, a stark contrast to the simplicity of her previous life. On the bed lay clothes and accessories selected for her. If you need anything, I'll be nearby, Amir said with a warm smile. Lila thanked her, but couldn't shake the feeling of being a stranger in this place that night. As she gazed at the horizon from her room's balcony, her thoughts turned to Ain. The pain of being away from him was suffocating, but she had to believe she was doing what was best to secure his future. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Karan. Tomorrow will visit my trusted doctor, he informed her before leaving. Layla nodded silently. The weight of her decision grew heavier with each passing moment, but there was no turning back now. The next morning, Lila woke early, the silence of the mansion more unsettling than comforting. Her first night there had been sleepless, filled with incessant thoughts about what lay ahead. The bed was soft, the sheets silk, but the weight of reality made peace impossible to find. Soon Amir knocked on the door to escort her to Cum's doctor. The journey through the mansion was marked by its evident luxury hallways, adoring with Persian rugs, paintings by renowned artists, and vast windows, showcasing the meticulously maintained gardens. Leia barely had time to take it all in before stepping into the limousine that would take them to the clinic. The doctor's office was in a modern building in the heart of Dubai. Dr. Ibrahim, a man with a calm demeanor and a reassuring voice, greeted Layla professionally. After thorough examinations, he declared that everything was in perfect condition to begin the first fertilization process. Leah nodded silently, trying to mask her unease. Kareem remained distant throughout the procedure, observing from afar with his usual composed posture. For him, this was merely another step toward fulfilling his responsibilities, but for Lila, it was a painful reminder that at the end of those 9 months she would face the heartbreak of leaving behind a piece of herself back at the mansion. Leia tried to distract herself by exploring the place. Every room seemed more extravagant than the last, as if Kareem's wealth knew no bounds. There was a library with floor-to-ceiling shelves, an indoor pool surrounded by marble columns, and a music room filled with exotic instruments. Despite its splendor, the mansion felt empty, almost soulless. Layla noticed that although Kim lived surrounded by beauty, his life seemed marked by deep loneliness. He rarely smiled, and his few acts of courtesy were cold and calculated. In the first few days, Kareem limited his interactions with Lila. To practical matters, he ensured everything was in line with the contract, but never attempted to build a personal connection. Layla, on the other hand, felt increasingly out of place. She spent her nights staring at the ceiling, wondering how her son was doing, and her mornings trying to come to terms with the fact that soon she would carry a child she couldn't call her own. In the second week, Kareem hosted a formal dinner at the mansion. For some business associates, Layla was instructed to dress elegantly and accompany Kareem as part of the agreement. The dress she wore was stunning, but her steps were uncertain as she descended the grand staircase in the hall. The guests observed her with curiosity. Some greeted her politely, while others exchanged glances that made her feel exposed. Kareem, however, stayed by her side the entire time. Introducing her as my special guest, "Are you okay?" he asked in a rare moment of concern as they stepped aside to a quieter corner. "I'm trying to adjust," Leah replied honestly. Kareem nodded but said nothing more for him. Social events were a formality, an extension of his obligations for Lila. However, it was a plunge into a world she didn't fully understand. After the dinner, Lila went up to her room exhausted before sleeping. She called her neighbor to check on, and her son's cheerful voice comforted her, but also brought tears. She felt an overwhelming longing, but she knew she couldn't give in to the temptation to turn back. As the days passed, Leah began. All of this feels so temporary. Kareem turned to her, and for a brief moment his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her hold her breath. The future can be built. Layla, it all depends on how we choose to handle the present. Layla felt a warmth she couldn't explain from those words. Although he hadn't spoken directly, there was an implicit promise in his tone, something that made her believe that destiny might still be unwritten. The staff at the mansion began to notice the change in atmosphere. The coldness that once filled the place had been replaced by a lighter, almost welcoming vibe. Amir in particular was pleased to see how Kareem seemed less isolated and more open. Lila also noticed changes within herself for the first time in months. She felt she was reconnecting with a part of herself she thought she'd lost. Even so, Layla knew she was approaching a crossroads. She was fully aware that the feelings developing between her and Kareem could complicate things even further. But for now, she chose to embrace the present, even though the future remained uncertain. Dawn brought a soft light to the mansion, but Lila felt restless. The bond forming between her and Kim was something she hadn't anticipated, and the weight of the secret about Aman grew heavier. Each day, the possibility of Kareem discovering the truth terrified her. Yet keeping it hidden was becoming increasingly unbearable after breakfast. Lila decided to walk through the gardens to clear her mind. She tried to lose herself among the flowers and trees, but her peace was interrupted when she heard Amira calling her. Urgently, Lila hurried back to the mansion and found Kareem in the living room holding a photograph. His expression was difficult to read. "Who is this boy?" he asked, his voice controlled, but laden with tension. Leah froze. The photo in his hands was of Iman, one of the few she had brought with her. She had hidden it carefully, but somehow Kareem had found it. "He's my son," Leela admitted, her voice trembling. The silence that followed was suffocating. Kareem walked slowly toward her, his dark eyes locked on hers. "You lied to me," he said, his voice low but sharp. "Why didn't you tell me from the start?" Layla felt tears welling up, but forced herself to keep her head high. "I was afraid it would complicate everything, that you'd think I wasn't suitable for the contract." Kareem crossed his arms, still scrutinizing her. "And why did you agree to this knowing you'd have to leave another child behind?" The question hit Lila like a blow. She took a deep breath before answering. "I did it for him, for the bills. The overdue rent, the nights he went to bed hungry. I had no other choice." Her words were filled with emotion, and Kareem remained silent for a long moment, as though processing everything he had just heard. Finally, he turned and walked to the window. "You should have trusted me," he said, gazing at the horizon. Layla felt the weight of disappointment in his words and couldn't hold back her tears. She knew this moment could shatter the connection they were building, but she also knew she could no longer hide the truth. Later that night, Kareem asked Layla to join him in the library. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp, creating an intimate yet tense atmosphere. Kareem sat in his usual chair, a folder of documents in front of him. "I've reviewed the terms of our contract," he began bluntly. "There's nothing in it that mentions the possibility of you keeping secrets like this. However, it also doesn't address how to handle the situation we're in now." Lila felt a wave of panic. "Please don't send me away. I'll fulfill my part of the agreement, I promise." Kareem raised a hand to stop her. "I'm not suggesting that, but trust is essential, Layla, and now we need to rebuild it." He opened the folder and pulled out a sheet, sliding it toward her so she could read. "I want you to see and you're allowed to visit him, but on one condition: he cannot know the truth. Truth about our arrangement." "Not yet." Layla blinked, stunned. Kareem's generosity caught her off guard, but it also brought a fresh wave of guilt. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kim sighed, folding his hands on the table. "Because I know what it's like to grow up without answers. I want your son to have at least part of your presence, even if it's only temporary." Those words carried a pain Leah hadn't expected. For the first time, she felt she was beginning to understand the reasons behind Kareem's rigid demeanor. He wasn't just a man seeking an heir. He was also someone carrying deep scars. The next day, Lila was taken to visit Jan. The journey was long, but each mile brought her closer to her son. When she arrived, emotions overwhelmed her. and ran into her arms the moment he saw her, and Leah held him tightly as if she never wanted to let him go. "Mommy, you're back," he exclaimed, his voice filled with joy. Layla smiled, but her heart felt heavy. She knew this visit was only temporary and that soon she would have to leave him again. They spent the day together, playing and laughing as they had in the old days, but as night fell, Layla felt the weight of their impending goodbye. When the moment came, Ammon hugged her tightly, asking when she would return soon. "My love," she promised, even though she knew how uncertain that word was. His expression, calm. "How is he?" he asked, his voice laced with genuine concern. Leah sank into the sofa across from him, feeling completely vulnerable. "He's well happy, but it's hard to leave him." Kareem nodded as if he understood perfectly. He said nothing more, but his gaze conveyed something words couldn't express. In the days that followed, the dynamic between them shifted. There was a quiet understanding, a mutual respect that hadn't existed before Kareem became more considerate, and Lila in turn began to trust him. More small gestures, like sharing a meal or chatting during a walk in the gardens, became meaningful moments one evening as they sat in the library. "Things are changing around here. The mansion has never felt so full of life." Leah felt her face flush, but didn't respond. She knew Amira was referring to the shifting dynamic between her and Kareem, as uncertain as she still felt about the future. It was undeniable that something was blossoming. As the days passed, Ilayla began to notice that Kim was changing too. He spent more time with her, showing himself to be more vulnerable and approachable. Conversations that were once brief and formal now stretched for hours, with both of them sharing more about their lives. In one of those conversations, Kareem revealed something that deeply touched Lila. "I never knew how to cope with losing my mother," he confessed, his voice heavy with emotion. "She was the anchor of our family. When she was gone, everything fell apart." Layla felt a wave of empathy. She knew what it was like to lose someone important, even if in different ways. That moment created an even stronger bond between them. Despite their growing closeness, Leah knew the contract was still a barrier, as much as she was growing attached to Kareem. The reality of their situation couldn't be ignored. She spent sleepless nights wondering about the future, trying to balance her feelings with her responsibilities. One night, Kay knocked on her door asking to talk. He seemed unsettled, as if grappling with something important. "I know we have our limitations," he began, sitting in the chair across from Lila's bed. "But I want you to know that I'm trying to understand what all of this means." Layla felt her heart race. There was something in his words that hinted at a significant shift. "I'm trying to," she replied honestly. Kim nodded, seeming relieved to hear that. Despite the lingering uncertainties, both were willing to face whatever came next together. The mansion staff began to notice the impact of these changes. Amira, ever observant, remarked how Kareem seemed lighter, more human. Even the other employees commented on how Lila's presence had transformed the once cold and impersonal atmosphere. Lila, for her part, felt more at home. Despite the weight of the contract, she started seeing the mansion as more than just a temporary stop. It was a place where she was building something, even if she wasn't yet sure what it would become. At the end of each day, as she gazed at the stars, Leah knew she was approaching a turning point. The bond forming between her and Kareem was something she hadn't planned for, but now felt inevitable. Both were changing, and the journey they had started together was beginning to take a shape. Neither could have predicted the days at the mansion continued to pass, but something undeniable lingered in the air. Layla and Kareem's connection was deepening. Small gestures, lingering glances, and extended conversations hinted that the boundaries of the contract were being challenged. Yet Lila knew that every moment they shared was leading her closer to a critical juncture. One morning, as Kareem reviewed documents in his office, Layla walked in with a tray of coffee. He looked up, clearly surprised, but said nothing as she set the tray on the desk. "I thought you could use a break," she said, trying to sound casual. Kareem studied her for a moment before replying, "Thank you. Lately, it's been hard to stay focused." Layla hesitated before sitting in the chair opposite him. "Something with the business?" He shook his head, "No. Just a lot to process." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Both seemed to weigh the unspoken words hanging between them. Layla finally broke the silence. "Do you feel you've made the right decision so far?" Kareem looked at her, his expression softening. "I'm not sure. Life taught me to be pragmatic, But sometimes I wonder if being so rigid has distanced me from what truly matters. Layla sensed the vulnerability in his words for the first time. He seemed to be admitting that more was at stake than just his family and business obligations. In the days that followed, their routine began to shift. Kareem started inviting Layla to accompany him. To the meetings and social events, he seemed genuinely interested in including her in his world, and Layla began to understand better the pressures and responsibilities he carried during a charity dinner. Kareem introduced Lila as his companion. The guests exchanged curious glances, but Kareem appeared indifferent to him. The opinions of others were irrelevant. Lila, however, felt uneasy under the weight of the attention. Together, Kareem held Leah's hand and said, "I know we still have a lot to face, but I want you to know, I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this work." Leela felt her heart fill with hope, for the Keonaner seemed more attentive, more present, as if he was finally beginning to grasp the depth of the life Layla had led before stepping into his world one morning as they had coffee on the terrace. Karen made an unexpected suggestion. "I want Iman to live here," he said, his voice calm yet resolute. Leah's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you serious?" she asked, still processing the idea. "Yes, if we're going to build something together, I want him to be part of it from the beginning." Leah's heart raced. The thought of having her son close was everything she had hoped for. But doubts lingered, and what about the contract, she questioned hesitantly. CM took a deep breath before responding. "The contract doesn't have to be a barrier. We can adjust the terms to ensure Iman has a place here, without compromising anything." Layla remained silent, deeply moved by Kareem's willingness to adapt his life for her. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any words could. Preparations for Iman's arrival began. Immediately, Kareem instructed Amir to prepare a room for him, decorated with elements Layla suggested. She wanted the space to feel warm and familiar, with touches that reminded Iman of the home where he had grown up on the day of Iman's arrival. Lila was anxious when the mansion doors opened and An ran into her arms. She held him tightly as if to shield him from everything. "This place is huge." "Mom!" An exclaimed, his eyes wide with curiosity. As he looked around, Kareem, who had been observing from a distance, approached slowly. He knelt to Aon's level and extended his hand. "Welcome, An. I hope you'll like it here." The boy shook his hand with a shy smile. "Thank you, sir." Cum smiled, and Lila noticed that even in his seriousness, there was a genuine effort to connect with Aman. The first few days were a mix of adjustments and discoveries. Aman quickly adapted to the luxurious environment of the mansion, exploring every corner and asking curious questions about everything. Cum, though reserved, showed patience and interest. Answering each of his questions calmly one night, as Lila tucked An into bed, he asked, "Mom, is Mr. Kareem a good man?" Lila was surprised by the question, but answered honestly, He's learning to be better every day." N smiled, satisfied with the answer, and soon fell asleep. Layla sat by his side, watching his peaceful face for the first time while she felt like she was on the right path. Over time, Kareem and Ayan began to form a bond. They spent afternoons playing chess or walking in the gardens. Kareem, who once seemed so distant, revealed a more relaxed and caring side during one of their walks. Iman suddenly stopped and looked up at Kareem. "Do you like my mom?" he asked with the innocent curiosity of a child. Kareem chuckled, surprised by Iman's frankness. "I do," he replied sincerely. "She's a very special woman." Iman smiled and continued walking, leaving Kareem with a faint smile on his face. That simple yet meaningful exchange was a sign that their bond was growing stronger. One afternoon, Leela found Kum in his office, reviewing documents. She entered, slowly hesitating. "Can I interrupt?" she asked, holding a cup of tea. Kareem looked up and smiled always. She sat on the nearby sofa watching as he returned his attention to the papers. There was something reassuring about seeing him so focused and dedicated. "You're working so hard for us," she said, breaking the silence. Kareem sat down his pen and looked at her directly. "Because you're worth it." The simplicity of his response made Lila's heart race. She knew that despite all the challenges, she was building something real with him. The months flew by, and the Al-Fed mansion was filled with a different energy. The relationship between Kareem and Layla deepened, and Iman became an essential part of their home. Their bond flourished amidst new experiences, and the anticipation of the baby's arrival brought them even closer one evening, as Lila rested on the terrace. She felt a slight discomfort in her abdomen, thinking it was just another pregnancy symptom. She tried to ignore it, but the pain grew more intense. Alarmed, she called for Amira, who immediately rushed to Kareem. Layla is going into labor, Amira announced, her eyes wide with urgency. Kareem ran to the bedroom, finding Lila breathless, trying to manage the contractions. We're going to the hospital now, he said firmly, holding her hand. The drive to the hospital was 10 kilometers, usually composed. Couldn't hide his worry. He gripped Lila's hand tightly, whispering words of encouragement as he watched her with anxious eyes. Everything will be fine. Leah, I'm here with you, he repeated reassuringly upon their arrival. The medical team took over, but Kareem refused to leave Lila's side. He stayed with her throughout the labor, holding her hand and encouraging her every step of the way. Hours later, the sound of a baby's cry filled the room. Kareem looked up, a tiny boy in his arms, his heart overflowing with emotion. He's beautiful. Layla, perfect, he said, tears welling in his eyes. Leela smiled, exhausted but overjoyed. It was a moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. A few days after the birth, Lila was resting in the bedroom with the baby in her arms when Kareem entered holding an envelope. He sat beside her, his expression serious but his eyes shining with tenderness. Layla, I want you to know something, Kareem began as he opened the envelope. This contract no longer holds any value before her surprised eyes. Kareem tore the document into small pieces, letting them fall to the floor. Everything I've done so far has been for you and for our family. I don't want anything, not even a contract, to define our future. Kareem took Lila's hands and with a gaze full of love, knelt before her. Layla, you've brought light into my life. You've taught me what true love is and what it means to have a family. I want to spend the rest of my life by your side, raising our children and facing whatever comes together. He opened a small velvet box, revealing a delicate ring with a diamond that softly reflected the light. Will you marry me? Tears streamed down Leah's face. Her heart raced with joy, and she could barely speak. Yes, Kareem, I will, and who had been peeking through the door ran toward them and hugged them tightly. We going to be a real family, he exclaimed. Beaming, Kareem lifted the boy into his arms, and together they celebrated the moment that marked the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The months leading up to the wedding were filled with joy and preparations. Lila wanted a ceremony that reflected her roots and the love they had built, and Kareem made sure to fulfill her every wish. The mansion transformed into a fairy tale setting, adorned with exotic flowers, delicate lights and details blending both Arabic and Western traditions. Finally, the big day arrived. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the garden where the ceremony would take place. Layla looked stunning in a white dress with golden accents, while Anne, dressed in a small formal suit, proudly carried the rings as Leah walked down the aisle. Kareem's eyes filled with emotion. He watched her with admiration, as if seeing her for the first time. You look breathtaking, he whispered. Taking her hands, the vows were simple yet deeply meaningful. They promised love, respect, and partnership, sealing their commitment with a kiss that drew heartfelt applause from the guests. The reception was a celebration of cultures and love. Traditional Arabic music blended with melodies from Leah's homeland, creating a festive and warm atmosphere. Aeon ran around the hall, thrilled with his new baby brother and the new life they were building. This is the start of everything I've ever dreamed of, Leah said as she watched the scene beside Kareem. And it's only the beginning, he replied, holding her hand. By the end of the night, under a starry sky, Kareem and Lila danced together, surrounded by family and friends, celebrating a love that had overcome every barrier. It was the perfect ending to a journey that began unexpectedly, but blossomed into a story of true love. While Aman played with the baby Kareem and Lila exchanged glances that promised to face the future together. No matter the challenges, they knew they had everything they needed: love, unity, and a family that would continue to grow. And so, under the shining desert stars, their story reached its perfect conclusion. A new beginning filled with hope, love, and happiness. What do you think, did Layla make the right decision by forgiving and marrying Kareem? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with all our stories, and make sure to check out more heartwarming stories by clicking here on the end screen.